Why is the NHS short of staff? Was Prince Harry right to go to court? And are electric cars as green as we thought? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Jackie Doyle-Price, Labour MP Sam Tarry, Kezia Dugdale from the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, and Reform UK's candidate for London Mayor and Fair Fuel campaigner Howard Cox. Today, cancer doctors say staff shortages across the UK are putting patients at risk.
They're telling us that we just don't have enough doctors at any point of the pathway.
So can the Health Secretary get the NHS back to full strength?
There has been a significant increase in demand, and that's why we're investing more.
Rowan Atkinson says he feels duped into buying an electric car. We'll find out why. And Prince Harry says he went to court for Meghan. Is he right to take on the tabloids? Well, let's start with that final story. Prince Harry in court. You can see here the headline, Emotional Duke says he went to court for Meghan, giving evidence at the High Court. He said during his, emotional final day of evidence yesterday that he hoped the High Court case would stop the abuse, intrusion and hate towards him and his wife. Starting with you, Jackie, has the Duke of Sussex done the right thing in taking this case to court, saying what he did against the publisher of the Daily Mirror?
Well, that's a matter for him, actually. I mean, and clearly he, from the statement he's made, he feels very strongly about that and he's entitled to defend himself and his family. To be honest, for me, I always took a self-denying ordinance not to talk about Prince Harry once he left royal life, and I find the soap opera around him and his wife very, very time-consuming, really, and not something I really want to get engaged in. But the actual substance of what he's done in court in terms of challenging practices by the tabloids, I think is a debate we should be having, actually.
Do you think it's changed? Do you think things have changed? Have the tabloids cleaned up their act in the way Prince Harry has demanded?
I think they might have changed the tools they use to do the job, but their behaviour hasn't changed at all. I mean, they are, in fact, I would go as far as to say that they're more sensationalist than ever, because so much now is content is accessed online, so it's designed around clickbait. It's designed on getting you to scroll down and follow these stories. So I still think there's a way to go, but actually, they're producing what the public want to read.
Well, and that's what they would argue. It's demand. Of course, there's a difference between the means and the way they get information and being sensationalist all the same. Sam, what's your view? Was he right to go to court, the Duke of Sussex? Do you think he's achieved anything?
I think that probably remains to be seen what he's achieved, but in terms of taking a stand against what are, in my view, as an elected politician, a completely pernicious and toxic influence on political discourse, the way that tabloid newspapers, not only do, as Jackie's rightly described, go for kind of clickbait, often targeting women MPs, for example, have been, some horrendous targets, but also the way that they divide and demonise whole sections of society on a regular basis, I think is just awful. And actually, it's not about saying that this is what consumers want. They are producing a project which has quite a political agenda, and I think it's very divisive.
But on both sides,
dangerous.
wouldn't you argue? It's a political agenda, whether you take one from the right or one from the left, and it is what consumers buy.
But the impact, is toxic on political culture, debate in this country. It pushes people against each other, and I think that for me is something I want to see less of, not more of.
Well, on the basis of that, Kezia, it sounds like he hasn't quite achieved or exposed what he hoped to, and obviously it's been covered extensively, certainly since he's given evidence, even if not in the run-up for reasons that we can assume. Was he right, though, to go and make the statements he did about the press and the government?
I think so, yes. I think he was right to do it. He has a right as an individual to do it. He has the means and I think therefore a duty to take on what he said before, which is to reform the tabloid press. So I commend him for that. And I think he's doing the public a service as well, because the levels of trust in the media are falling at fairly spectacular levels. I mean, Reuters are showing since 2015 there's been a significant drop in trust in the tabloid press and in the media more generally. I think that's something we should all be concerned by. Right.
Critics would say, of course, that they've done their fair share, Harry and Meghan, to court the press, as have other members of the royal family. And in that sense, that's the quid pro quo.
Well, sure, that's the deal. But what we're talking about here are the practices that are put to generate the stories that we all read and buy. And this is ultimately a story about phone hacking and whether that took place. We thought we'd resolved that 15 years ago, but we know that, you know, year in, year out, there are still many claims against the tabloid press that are settled out with of court. And Harry's taken a very prominent one right into the forefront of public discourse, and I commend him for that. Howard?
Well, I'm sympathetic with some of the comments that have been said here, but he's made his bed and he's lying in it. In other words, when he needs the media, he uses them, and he's rolling in money, his Netflix deals and all those sorts of things. I just think he's gone a bit too far by criticising the government, becoming political.
Right, well, when he said it had reached rock bottom, exactly. He was talking mainly about the press, but he talked about the government too. Yes, what did you think of that remark?
I mean, as I say, he's talking broadly about the political culture of which the government's a player. And, you know, ultimately, we do need to show some leadership. And I have some sympathy with what Sam says. But, you know, sometimes we play those toxic political games. I make a point of not doing, actually. I play by the principle, play the ball, not the man. And I think we could all benefit a lot more from that. And government does need to show some leadership and give instructions to media about what's acceptable and what isn't.
Oh, well, but that might be seen as trying to interfere with the freedom of the press.
I don't know. I think asking the press to be responsible is not interfering with freedom of speech.
Do you agree with that, Sam?
Look, what I would like to see is a serious conversation amongst politicians of all, you know, parties about the kind of discourse we have, but also what's acceptable in terms of things like fake news. I mean, you know, we used to have a culture of proper investigative journalism in this country, and it just seems to be dying a death, and that is not a good thing. The Fifth Estate is part of a healthy democracy, and that is something where, you know, whether it's anonymous briefings, whether it's, you know, things that are just simply untrue being repeated in verbatim, even in mainstream newspapers like The Times and so forth, you know, this is a step backwards for democracy itself. We need proper, thorough, investigative journalists. You know, I joined a few journalists yesterday about local cutbacks in the BBC. You know, that's another problem because local democracy and local journalism are really important. All of these feed into distrust in politicians, distrust in the media, and I think if you only have to look across the Atlantic at how dangerous completely partisan media
we're all in
is.
favour of more scrutiny of politicians, I can tell you that on this programme and across the BBC. Let's move on to this headline. BBC News. NHS struggling to provide safe cancer care, say senior doctors. They've been talking on the airwaves today. The Royal College of Radiologists is warning that all 4 UK nations are facing chronic staff shortages, with patients waiting too long for vital tests and treatments. Jackie, almost 1 in 10 posts in NHS England is vacant. Is that just a clear sign of government failure?
No, I don't think it is. And we talk about the NHS as if it's one great monolith. It's not. It's, you know, the NHS is our system of paying for and delivering free care at the points you need it. Within that, it's a dynamic system, so there will always be vacancies. What I'm pleased about...
Do you think 1 in 10 is acceptable, posts in NHS England being vacant? Do you think that's sustainable?
Well, when you say 1 in 10 posts in NHS England, what does that mean? Because NHS England is the commissioning authority. It's not actually the frontline practice.
All right, well, let me take one example. The UK has fewer doctors and nurses than many of its Western European counterparts. This is from official data from 2021. If you look at the OECD average of a whole range of comparable countries, we're at the bottom.
Well, I mean, you could present figures in any which way. But, I mean, the truth of the matter is we often look at our health system, we define it by how much we spend and how much people work in it. We actually should be looking much more in terms of outcomes and outputs. That's what we should do. We know we're placing a lot of demand on the health service. We expect more from it all the time. I don't think I can switch on a news programme without hearing another negative story about the NHS. Yet my constituents are broadly happy and broadly satisfied with the service they get.
Really?
I still think we have the best health service in the world, and I don't think it's a symptom of government failure at all.
Are your constituents broadly happy with the service they get?
They're absolutely hopping mad. I had a poor chap who is in our local hospital, had acute mental health crisis, 500 hours he spent on the ward, rather than actually, ironically, moving 200 metres down the road to actually the mental health hospital that was there. You know, people cannot get dental appointments, cannot get GP appointments for love nor money. I mean, the NHS is just not on its knees, it's on life support. That's how bad things are. And I'm sorry, Jackie, it's unacceptable to say, after 13 years, that that scale of vacancies is OK. It is not OK. I'd rather government and, you know, all parties were honest and say, look, we've had a real debate. We are going to have to put more money into the NHS.
Yes,
we're going to have to train a hell of a lot more doctors and nurses.
And
why hasn't it happened?
It's always demand for more and more money. You know, we should be actually focusing on what we want our health service to deliver, because there is not a bottomless pit of money.
Basic services at the moment.
There is not a bottomless pit of money.
People are literally dying because
and
it's so bad.
we're relying on NHS England to make sure that we're commissioning the services that people need.
Right. I mean,
that's the truth of the matter. And when we talk about, you know, things happening in hospitals, we've got to get that primary care out. We've got to get that intervention as early as possible, and that reduces demand. That comes down to how the NHS is managed. It's not about money.
Right. I mean, Sam, even the Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting has said, actually not just him, Keir Starmer in a speech in April, that obsession with simply pouring more money into hospitals must end. Is he right? He seems to agree with Jackie on reform.
I'm not saying there shouldn't be reform, right? But the number one thing at the moment is we need to sort out the pay crisis. You've got nurses on strike, you've got consultants voting to go on strike. You know, doctors are leaving in their hundreds to go to Australia, New Zealand and Canada because they're getting double their salary. You know, nurses are having to pay bursaries, so they're starting off as in a low-paid job in huge amounts of debt. That, for me, is the number one thing. And, of course, it's going to need to be reformed. It's a very old system that needs modernising. But the reality is, you know, you cannot escape the fact that it is going to cost more as the population, you know, gets older, when people have, you know, more expectations about how long they live.
We're waiting for this announcement on workforce funding. But what is your view about more money, more cash going in? And more cash is going in into the NHS, but we have an ever-growing ageing population. That demand is also growing. Money, reform.
Here we go again. We've got to reform it. This is the point. I don't know how many billions of pounds goes in per week, per day. The simple thing is it's not working. I agree with you, Sam, but I also agree with you that it's about management. What we need to do is actually start incentivising the staff, bringing back those staff that have left. Why have they left? Ask the question. Is it money or is it conditions? I can give you an example of a midwife in St Thomas's Hospital, for example, is giving up midwifery because she's got to pay ULEZ on a double shift over a situation. I'm bringing that in simply. Those are the sort of
low emission zone, yes, paying extra transport costs. I mean, just before I come to you then, Kezia, well, let's listen to Dr Tom Rock. He's Vice President of the Royal College of Radiologists, talking to the Today programme. He said the issue isn't just pay and conditions, but other things too.
We know that there are too many young doctors leaving the NHS. We know that senior doctors are retiring earlier than they were. And there are things we can do now to help that.
Pay?
Partly pay, but the biggest thing, I think, for senior doctors is just making our lives easier with better IT. I sit in clinic and I have to put in 6 or 7 passwords every time I see one patient to get into all the different systems. IT makes my life more complicated, whereas my phone makes my life outside work easier.
What do you think of that?
I mean, we're all laughing because we can recognise what he's saying there, that there is a big problem there. I mean, Jackie said, you know, she doesn't want the NHS to be one big monolith. I really wish it was. It's something that binds us as citizens across this country. It's a uniquely British thing. It's part of our DNA. We need to do everything we possibly can to protect it. And that same guy was saying on the radio this morning that every month's delay when it comes to cancer treatment can lead to a 10% chance in you actually surviving that. This is real people's lives. Like, we shouldn't just be having a kind of abstract conversation about whether it needs a bit more money or a bit less. Of course it needs more money.
Does it? But how much and how would it be paid for?
I know Scotland better than I know the UK figures.
You're the former leader there, Labour leader.
We spend 34% of our budget in Scotland on the NHS. The Scottish Fiscal Commission are predicting that in 40 years' time that will rise to 50% for no other reason than we're going to have older populations who have greater health demands. So it's a no-brainer. We are going to have to spend more money on the NHS. That doesn't mean we can't also reduce demand. There are many things we can do to help people live healthier lives.
But that takes time, doesn't it?
And
the waiting list, no, exactly.
So that means it needs to talk about immigration and bringing doctors to this country to address immediate needs, and it also means hard cash now. There's no escaping it.
Right, I mean, if Labour isn't going to commit vast amounts of cash, it says it's going to use that non-dom, or the money they would get from people on non-dom status. It'll be £3.2 billion. The budget is about £150 billion for the NHS. In England, it's a drop in the ocean, isn't it?
I think the King's Fund said there needed to be, when the Chancellor, the recent budget, made his announcement about the additional spending, they said it needed to be 10 billion. I think it said around 3 billion.
So where would you find that?
I think it's more complex than that. I think actually you touched on the issue of immigration. I represent the most diverse constituency in the whole of the UK. I have regular conversations with people who are in this country from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. I'm actually talking at the moment to a group of people, entrepreneurs working with a government agency in Bangladesh who are linking up actually with a Scottish university to put on the ground in Bangladesh a British standard nursing hospital to train people up to a British standard, and they'll finish the second part of their degree here in the UK. That, to me, seems to be a very sensible, globally outlooking way of potentially bringing highly trained staff to this country to accelerate, the vacancies being diminished.
Right, is that one way of meeting the demand?
To be honest, I think it's obscene the extent to which we rely on migrant labour to work in our NHS as it is. And we're taking the most talented people from overseas when they need to be developing their own nations. I come back to the issue about reform. I mean, essentially, the NHS is still run in the same way that it was when it was created 75 years ago, and yet the demands placed on it are significantly different. So we need a really fundamental look at how we get more bang for our buck.
What is that fundamental look, Jackie? When you say £150
billion.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's a huge budget, but you say we need to protect the NHS at all costs in the way it is sort of currently formulated. You say it needs fundamental change. What does that actually mean? Does it mean breaking it up? Does it mean private sector involvement? Does it mean outsourcing? What does it all mean in terms of...
It means earlier intervention, actually, and it means, we've just had an announcement, thankfully, from the government about making more use of pharmacy. Sam's quite right when he draws attention to people finding it difficult to get GP appointments. There's actually far too much that relies on going through a GP when you've got so many more specialisms. There is much more we can do to triage people, to get them access to what they need earlier, and that will actually save and get more efficiency
Jackie,
for that
the question
money.
I've got, right, we're 13 years in, right, why has this not
We're
been
actually
happening?
75 years into a developing NHS
the
demands has
quite
changed.
different now, even to 10 years ago. There are reforms happening all the time. You speak to my local hospital, I looked at my local radiology department, the innovations in technology they have there. It's not as if everything's completely ossified. This is a lack of a serious government strategy.
It's still based on
a
a
contradictory policy on migration that just clearly isn't working, and it isn't being honest with people in this country. Why not talk about some of the things that Andy Burnham's done, where he's trying to bring together health and social care? I think actually today the Fabian Society has published a very interesting report, and it's not Labour policy yet, it might be, where they're actually talking about integrating these two things. These are not new debates, but the problem is the government has just been incapable, and people are losing their lives because of this.
I don't accept that at all, Sam.
Well, I'm sorry, but it's a fact.
Let's be brutally frank. We effectively had to close down our NHS to protect it during the pandemic, and of course that leads to pent-up demand.
Were way before
it leads to pent-up demand, but what we actually need is to reform to get the most value out of our system.
All right, well, let's
and most
stick
efficiency out.
Well, let's stick on that, and also I'm going to show you just briefly this headline: BBC New Ghana patients in danger as nurses head for NHS in UK. You want to see higher levels of collaboration. Jackie doesn't think we should be training people here. Where are you on?
Well, this is hardly ideal, is it? But the reality is we do need doctors in this country, and there are doctors prepared to come and work here under the right circumstances. The way to resolve this being a long-term problem is to invest now in places for people to study medicine here. But 2 quick points around demand. Let's not pretend that money in the NHS just stays in the NHS. If we invest in the NHS, we can reduce the benefits bill, for example. So you see that saving recycled around the system. And secondly, housing's a big part of this.
Yes, it is.
A major reason behind old people ending up in hospital is because they trip and fall in their own house. Yep. If you retrofit houses to have handrails, you could reduce a significant amount of demand on the NHS. That means investing in housing rather than in primary care. We don't talk about housing nearly enough.
One of the things that I listened to what he said, I think his comment was, it's not just about money, it's about, he said IT, but I think it's a lot of bureaucratic incompetence. If he's actually having to fill 6 forms in, like the police do when they arrest someone, they have to fill in loads of things and go back to base. All those sorts of things are causing problems. Get that sorted, I think the efficiency would improve under the same amount of money.
People always say it's about bureaucracy, and you can have back office efficiencies and so on and so forth. Do you think that would be
Joe?
Right?
Not incompetent. This is the whole problem about what we're seeing right across the country at the moment. People are fed up the back teeth with the administration that's going on and not the frontline care.
You don't want the UK to be as reliant on foreign workers into the NHS, but would you want to see NHS staff come off the shortage occupation list at the moment when there are vacancies?
Well, we need a much more long-term approach to planning and managing workforce. And to be frank, it's only in recent years we've been properly addressing workforce issues. It's only now we're talking about having a workforce plan, despite the fact
Are you frustrated it hasn't actually turned up yet, this workforce plan?
Well, I'm glad it's finally happening at all, because we've always been so obsessed with money. But, you know, we've got to look at where the, you know, representative institutions have a role to play here. You know, the Royal Colleges, they all influence the number of people that get trained, and they also need to be part of this challenge.
And does the money, any extra funding, have to be new money that comes for this workforce plan, not taken from existing NHS budgets?
As I say, I still think we can get a lot more efficiency from the amount of money that we spend. I mean, Howard's referred to the bureaucracy. I mean, there is an awful lot of money spent in commissioning. And not all of that's efficient. If I could relate it to a local example, you know, it's 6 years since my local NHS announced that they were closing a hospital and replacing it with 4 new medical centres within the community. So far, we've got 1 of those and not a spade in the ground for the other 3. 6 years. Now, this shows that we've got a really incompetent commissioning system, and we can get a lot more value out of that.
All right, well, let's talk about electric cars, electric vehicles. We're only 7 years away until the UK bans the sale of new petrol and diesel cars, so by 2030. In a moment, we're going to speak to Robert Llewellyn. He's the presenter of the Fully Charged show on YouTube, which promotes electric vehicles. He's a big fan. Howard, you're the founder of Fair Fuel UK. Why do you want to scrap the ban?
It's very simple. It's a draconian ban. It wasn't. We didn't ask for it. It's undemocratic. It's based on an informed premise for a start. And what's really worrying, it's impacting on low-income families, small businesses, etc., who can't afford to buy electric vehicles. And this is one of the things we talked about fake news in the press earlier. I'm portrayed as anti-electric vehicle. I'm not. I'm very pro-electric vehicle, but it should compete with other clean fuel technologies like hydrogen, synthetic fuels and catalysts and those sorts of things.
Robert Llewellyn, perhaps you can persuade Howard otherwise.
Oh, I'm sure I can't, and I wouldn't want to try. There's no point. But I think that it's a very brave and I have to say surprising ruling. And I was very impressed that the government did do that. They were democratically elected. So, you know, I don't know that you can really classify it as undemocratic. They are in a position of enormous power at the moment. So they have chosen to do that. And I think what it does is what the easy scaremongering is to say, oh, in 2030, you'll literally not be allowed to drive your combustion car. You'll be banned and arrested and forced into a camp or some ridiculous stuff like that. There will be combustion cars for the next 25 years on the roads because people will buy them now. They're buying them by the ton still at the moment, huge, big SUVs and ridiculously inefficient cars. So what it means is you can't buy new ones. You can still use your combustion cars. So they're still going to be going. And what we're seeing now, which I'm predicted, just wait a minute, please, Howard. I didn't interrupt you.
Oh,
what we're seeing at the moment is...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can interrupt me.
All right, go on, Howard.
Robert, I'm not trying to interrupt you. I actually, and listen to what I just said, I believe in EVs, I believe in hybrids.
Yeah.
But why are we not having 4 or 5? The only reason are different clean fuel technologies. Why can't electric vehicles actually compete properly without a draconian ban on diesel and petrol vehicles? If we allowed Euro 6 to develop to Euro 7, Euro 8, that means cleaner fuel technology using diesel and petrol, and they are much cleaner. What is that?
What's Euro 6?
Well, it's a standard set up by the European, well, it was the EEC, in my old days, etc. They created a thing which actually, the amount of emissions that are coming out.
Right.
The higher the number, the less emissions are coming out.
All right, well, let's stick to the idea of ban or not. But, Robert, do you want to answer the point in principle?
Yes, I mean, there have been enormous changes in vehicle emissions, but I would still say I would love Howard or anyone else I want an experiment I've offered many people. They drive into a sealed container for 2 minutes in their clean diesel, and I'll drive into a neighbouring sealed container in an electric car with the engine running, and then we'll have chat about it afterwards. There is no such thing as clean combustion. That is a critically important point, which is always, always ignored. And where does the fuel come from? E-fuels are insanely expensive. entirely implausible, but people can use the term, let's use e-fuels. It sounds nice. They're really clean. Let's use hydrogen. Hydrogen is incredibly expensive and it's a fossil fuel.
All right.
98% of commercial hydrogen comes from natural gas.
Robert, there's a lot of things we agree on here, but the one thing is, let's go down to the underground tube. There's 4,000% more particulates down in the underground. And we're not seeing anyone do anything about that and cleaning that sort of thing up. Look, we're seeing a ULEZ expansion process. There was a public consultation last year into expanding it into Greater London. I'm sorry that this is a national audience, but that's going through. And even TfL, Transport for London, have said that there will be no demonstrable difference to the air quality we breathe by introducing a cash-grabbing tax on hard-pressed motorists, low-income families and small businesses. That's the thing I'm talking about. Can we work to get cleaner fuel technology without these bans?
Right, before Robert answers, I'm going to bring in the other guest, because Jackie, you actually have an electric car. Are you a fan or not?
No, not at all.
Why?
I have not regretted a car purchase more than my electric car. It's a complete change in driving experience. The time was when getting into your car and be able to go where you want to was a liberating thing. I mean, I have the other month I did a round trip to Dover and back to my house in Grays, which was 120 miles, and I had to stop and charge the car midway through to actually be able to get home. That's an extra hour on the journey. It's a completely different driving experience. EVs are great for being a little run around, but if you're going any distance, you actually still need a different alternative. I loved my hybrid when I had a hybrid, so I'm all in favour of electric technology, but this all or nothing into electric is, as Howard says, it's not the right policy option.
Robert, what do you say in terms of the logistics, the lack of chargers available to make it easier?
I mean, there's still not enough chargers, but there are 68,000 of them in the UK. So, I mean, we put in 17,000 new chargers this year alone. So that is changing very rapidly. In other countries, it's a completely different picture. So I don't know what electric car you have, but I mean, the fact that it won't do 120 miles on one charge suggests to me that it's not one of the better ones. So the average range of new electric cars now is between 150 and 250 miles.
Depends on the weather. You know, if it on a summer's day like today, it probably could get to 120 miles, but not in the dead of winter when battery technology is extremely inefficient.
Robert, one other thing, just to bring up, you will have read the Rowan Atkinson article. We can show a headline, actually. I love electric vehicles, but was an early adopter, but increasingly I feel duped. Now, Robert, he is talking about the batteries. He, broadly paraphrasing, says that actually producing lithium batteries isn't that environmentally friendly either, and he has been a fan, as he said. What do you say to that?
I mean, for a start, his references are very incorrect. And in fact, The Guardian has just published a correction piece about his opinion piece because there were some genuine factual inaccuracies. That's really besides the point. I'm not bothered about that.
No.
The thing we have to remember is that the battery technology of 5 years ago, which is what people are talking about now, is already dated, that the battery technology is developing incredibly rapidly. So we are looking now already at vehicles with 1,000 miles range, which is ridiculous and it's completely unnecessary. But that is now technically possible. There are batteries being produced with zero cobalt, which is another great hammer that people love to hammer electric cars with. What about the cobalt? There's cobalt used to refine diesel and petrol. That is now the major use of it. And we should stop mining cobalt and we should stop children being involved in that.
All right, well, Sam, Labour is also supporting a ban on the sale of new, quite rightly, as Robert said, of new petrol and diesel cars. Do you back that?
I think it is the right target. I do think it's going to be difficult to get there because I think, we're only 7 years away from it at the moment. I think that one of the things that's been very interesting, for example, I recently had a conversation with Sadiq Khan, and it's now been announced that we've expanded the scrappage programme eligibility. Because this is the thing, right? I do agree with one thing, working class people cannot be the ones that have the most inability to pay and often are the people that have to rely on their cars. You talk about nurses, for example, earlier. Often if you're working in a community, you're travelling, you do need a vehicle
and
of your own.
electric cars are expensive at the moment, the average price.
So there's a gap, essentially, from where we want to be. I think there are issues around, the charging points and so forth. Look, I've always been a massive advocate for public transport. Look at the transformation the Elizabeth line has made for London. It's interesting.
How long did that take to come online?
Far too long. But it's transformed London. It's shrunk London by 20 minutes. If they'd done the same equivalent, and I think even some Conservative MPs have now come out and said this, for the north of England, you linked up Sheffield, Leeds and Manchester, you'd be such a huge economic boost and probably get millions of cars off the road.
Right. Is it a brave decision, as Robert opened the discussion with, in terms of having this deadline, or is it something we should all aspire to?
It's absolutely the aspiration that we should have, and it's a classic example of nudge economics. The idea that this target in 2030 might decide behaviours that we have in our lives today, I think, is the only way that we're going to drive that behavioural change. So I support the 2030 ban, but at the same time I agree with Sam, the ownership of an electric car right now is a middle-class pursuit. It's one that's happening in our household right now. We're thinking about renewing the car next year. You've got to remember, well, Scotland doesn't have the public infrastructure in transport terms that London does. I can't get to my mum's and back in an electric car right now without stopping and charging it. But with the bit of technological advance and the investment that we need to hit that 2030 target, that will be the reality in a few years' time.
So are you going to do it or not? Are you going to make it the next one?
I need to ask my wife. I don't have the authority to make these decisions in live
It's above your pay grade.
Just briefly, there's an elephant in the room. We did, Fairfield UK actually commissioned a report with the Alliance of British Drivers and the Motorcycle Action Group, so right spread of the drivers across the road users, to actually the impact of the 2030 ban on the economy. And we're looking at something like the benefits. This is the CEBR did it, the Centre for Economic Business Research, totally independent. And they showed that the benefits the cost is 5 times any alleged benefits in terms of the green economy. Something like £1,000 per household will be paid to 2050 for us moving to the 2030 ban.
What about the cost of not reacting to the climate crisis that we're faced with? The fact that fossil fuels are going to be...
Well, we disagree. I don't believe there's I'm a climate change realist. That's what I am.
A sceptic.
Yeah, I'm a sceptic. I want to see the evidence. I see science on both sides, and I'm afraid I don't believe there's a crisis. I believe we've got to do something.
Well, the evidence is fossil fuels running out.
Sorry?
You must accept that fossil fuels are running out and they're increasingly expensive to extract.
Not for 100 years.
Well, we can argue about that, but the science is against you on that particular point, Howard. Robert, to come back to you, do you think the government will stick with this? I'm going to ask Jackie if they should, but do you think the government will stick with this?
I mean, I'm not convinced that they will, simply because the lobbying force and the money and the leverage that the automotive industry, in part, and mainly the fossil fuel industry have is enormous. They will fight it tooth and nail. I don't blame them. You know, it's their business is to make trillions and trillions of dollars profit every year, which they do. And that's a very important thing, which I know won't have been taken into account in the research that Howard just referred to, is how much money leaves our economy every day to pay for fossil fuel, how much electricity is used every day to refine fossil fuel. It's about the same amount as Leicester and Coventry combined. Every day, that's how much electricity nothing else, just electricity.
The fifth largest,
so we live in a very fossil fuel based economy. We've benefited from fossil fuel. There's no question. It's changed our world, and in many ways for the better. But it is time that we move on. And there are hundreds of people, very well-funded people, who will fight to the death to stop any change, because it makes sense for them economically. I completely understand it.
Do you think it'll be dropped?
I think it'll be pushed back.
Sorry, and yes, and Jackie.
I think the ideal thing would be to amend the policy, actually, to diversify it so it's not just electric.
Surely the thing to do would be actually to step up the scale of ambition of the government on tackling climate change. I don't want to be looking at my kid and saying, I'm really sorry, you're going to die of climate change, not old age. But that is the reality we're facing now.
But that drop the ban is what you're saying?
Well, I mean, I think we should still be investing in hybrids, because I think...
Sure, but drop the ban of the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030.
Hybrids are themselves petrol and diesel with obviously an electric component. So, you know, we have to obviously encourage better behaviour and tackle climate, but this is actually a very blunt tool which won't be effective and frankly will fuel a second-hand market, a very profitable second-hand market in combustion.
And the fifth largest income to the Treasury comes from drivers.
Robert Llewellyn, thank you very much for joining us. Here's a cheerful question for the end of the show. Are we in the end times? And if we are, is there anything we can do about it? Someone who might be able to answer that is our next guest, Peter Turchin, who's a professor at the University of Connecticut and has written a book called End Times, Elites, Counter-Elites and the Path of Political Disintegration. All right, well, it may not sound very cheerful. Peter, what's the problem with elites?
Well, complex human societies organized as states have existed for maybe 5,000 years. And they can function quite well for a time, maybe a century or so, but eventually they get into end times. These are the periods of social turbulence, political disintegration. Think the Russian Revolution, French Revolution, or the English Civil War of the 17th century. Why? One big problem that leads to end times is elite overproduction. It's like a game of musical chairs, except that instead of removing chairs, you actually adding more players. So as the number of players increase to 2 times, 3 times, 4 times the number of chairs, you can imagine the kind of chaos that can ensue.
Right, but are you arguing that we need to sort of lower the aspirations of millions of people so we don't get this overproduction of people at the top or in elite, so that we have the right number? Is that what you're suggesting for society?
Well, some competition is good, so we do need more elite wannabes or the elite aspirants than elite positions. But excessive competition is destructive. So, but let me unpack this a little bit. First of all, who are the elites? Elites simply are the small proportion of the population that concentrate social power in their hands. So think about the proverbial 1% in the United States, or the Mandarin class in Imperial China, or military nobility in medieval England, for example. The next question is how they are reproduced and recruited. So that's where the problem comes in, right? As the number of elite wannabes increase, then an increasing number of them are frustrated in getting their positions. And some of those decide to use more violent means to get ahead in the game.
Well, one example, should fewer school leavers go to university, for example?
No, let's separate education. Education is undiluted good, but the credentials that people, I am professor at the University of Connecticut. Maybe 10–15% of students there are really purely for education. The rest of them want to get the degrees so they can compete in the jobs market.
All right, well, let's open it up to our panel. You're at the University of Glasgow, or at the Centre, the John Smith Centre, and a professor. What do you make? Do you agree with Peter Turchin? You can have too many, an overproduction of people in this sort of elite strata, and it can lead to disintegration or social unrest.
So having had a look at the overview of his book, I think what he's arguing is that inequality will lead to the end of civilization. And that's definitely a message I can get on board with. But I'd much rather we talk about wealth distribution than concentrate on the educational levels of individual people in society. Of course, people should go to university and get degrees if those degrees and skills match the skills needs of the economy, so we can create sustainable jobs for people to go on and live good lives.
Right, but do you think there should be, in the way there was under the last Labour government, a sort of aspiration to send 50% of young people, school leavers, to university, whatever the match that might come out at the end?
I think at least 50% of school leavers should go into tertiary education. I think that can be a mixture of vocational qualifications that you do in college or university, and they should have equal status, much like they do in Germany and other countries that have a much stronger manufacturing and industrial base than the United Kingdom does. What
do you think about the thesis from Peter Turchin in terms of leading to the sort of inequality that can lead to difficulties?
I would fundamentally disagree with him. I think we actually need more, because these are the wealth creators. And frankly, society functions best when everyone feels that they're getting better off. If we have a limit on those...
Better off financially?
Yeah, well, and in terms... There's, not just financially, I mean, quality of life also. But, we encourage that by wealth creation that everybody can contribute to and benefit from. And frankly, we are becoming more and more reliant on a smaller number of very big taxpayers. We need more of those if we're going to carry on delivering the aspirations that we all have for a better life in future.
Sam?
Look, I joined the Labour Party because essentially I want to abolish elites and create a more egalitarian society, and that's not been against wealth creators, but it's to say we live in a society now where the smallest group of people in the last 1,000 years of history have the greatest power of concentration of wealth and power. That is completely wrong.
And the greatest contribution to taxpayers.
It's more complex than that. Our society is more unequal now than at almost any point in the last 100 years.
You say that actually, because Paul Johnson on this programme a while ago from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, very well respected, said inequality on pretty well any measure that you look at hasn't risen over the last decade. It's broadly flatlined. Inequality.
Well, I'll be interested to read that. I mean, look at child poverty compared to the last Labour government. It's gone through the roof. Even just over the last few years, the cost of living crisis, the people I'm seeing in my constituency.
But what he goes on to say is that everybody's standards have gone down.
Well,
so
is probably almost
but it's not the same as saying inequality,
true.
Is it?
But you've got on one hand, our country is wealthier than it's ever been, yet the wealth is concentrated in a smaller proportion of society. It's not distributed. As if the pie, it used to be more equally shared. Has now just got a tiny sliver for the rest of them. So we're fighting over the scraps. That is not the sign of a healthy society. It's not a sign of a society that's got happiness and well-being as part of the everyday lives of ordinary people. There are many examples around the world where more equal societies have far better senses of well-being, are far healthier on a whole range of things, not just mental, even physical health. And so it's possible, within a few hundred miles of our own shores.
Well, what sort of reform, from Reform UK, what sort of reform would you like to see?
Well, you may be surprised. I agree with Kezia and Sam more than I do with Jackie at the moment in this sort of thing. I think there's too much inequality in this country. We've had this phrase, levelling up the country. We know that came around in the last 3 or 4 years. The simple thing is, I believe we've got to help people. Like, for example, apprenticeships. I'm a big fan of Robert Halfon, Minister for Education. I work closely with him on Fairfield UK, as you know. But the thing is, you're getting, as I mentioned to you about the midwife, I know a senior nurse, senior sister in a hospital said that to progress further to the next grade, she needed a degree. And she's been actually nursing for 30 years.
Yeah,
well, that's the sort of thing, Jackie, that I can't stand.
The point you make actually about apprenticeships versus university degrees is an important one, I think, because if we're talking about wealth creation, your apprenticeship is a better route than going to university. And actually that comes back to, essentially, what we've had is the affluent middle classes have been dictating the shape of public policy, and it's not been about wealth creation. So we've got lots of overpaid intellectuals in universities taking fees from people.
Are you talking about Kezia and Peter Turchin? Are they the overpaid middle-class intellectuals here?
Quite possibly. But let's also recognise that lots of people that go and get a university degree go into public service. They are exactly the people that are in our hospitals, in our school system, investing in the next generation of skills across the whole of the country. This is about balance, though, isn't it? It's about having the right mix.
Right. Peter, what do you say in response to what you've heard?
Well, you've been talking about overproduction of youth with advanced degrees, but in my book, I actually talk more about the overproduction of wealthy people. In the United States, since the late 1970s, worker wages have stagnated. But as a result, all that extra wealth that was generated by the society went to the wealthy. The number of decamillionaires, people with $10 billion worth of fortunes, have increased tenfold over the past 40 years. And many of those newly wealthy people, or maybe inherited wealthy people, they actually decide to turn their wealth into political power. So Donald Trump would be a very good example of that. So as the number of uber wealthy people have increased tenfold, but the number of political positions is staying flat.
Right.
And now we have huge competition, and as a result of it, we saw it in 2016, there were 17 candidates during the Republican primaries, and there was a huge incentive for them to get ahead and start breaking the rules. We saw how the rules crumbled.
You're right. What do you make of inherited wealth? Does it just embed that inequality?
Yeah, this is where I sort of slightly part company with some members of my party. We're having a very active debate about inheritance tax at the moment. Yes, of course, if we... inherited wealth really does limit social mobility, and I'm a firm believer, as a working class Conservative by background, that everyone should have the opportunity to get on and make the best of themselves, and there's no doubt that inherited wealth limits that. So I do think there is a need to have some degree of inheritance tax in the system.
And wealth taxes more broadly, Sam?
Look, I think Peter is asking a very existential question about the danger of an unequal society.
Well,
and
the uber wealthy competing
Jackie
against each other.
represents Thurrock, which I happen to know very, very well. Brexit, the word no one wants to talk about. For me, that wasn't just about the European Union. It was about millions of working class people absolutely fed up with being poor, fed up with not being listened to, fed up with not having democratic say in the world around them, and a huge frustration. A big button was presented which was saying, clear off the lot of you in Westminster, they pressed that button. So actually, I think there is something in the thesis that he's saying, because that was born out of the anger around material concerns that millions of people in this country had.
Yeah, and the point he actually raised there about workers' wages being flatlined, that the Brexit vote was very much a reaction to that. And we still have this debate
and should they pay more then?
We still have this debate about satisfying demand for labour by immigrant labour when we should be paying them more.
Peter Turchin, thank you very much for joining us today. That's all we have time for on Politics Live. I will be back with Politics UK on Monday at 12:50. From all of us here, bye-bye.